Every Far Cry on the Steam Deck OLED. I also have an LCD version of this video, so we got Far Cry 1, 2, 3, 3 Blood Dragon, 4, 5, 6, and Far Cry New Dawn, Primal, and that's basically it. So we're going to be playing all of them. I own them on Uplay, but they are also available on Steam. Remember that if you get them on Steam, that doesn't mean that you don't need Uplay. Uplay will be launched as soon as you open the game on Steam, but it requires less work. If you want to see how to set up Uplay, link in the description. I have a quick tutorial on how to do it. Pretty simple, nothing to worry about. So also before starting, I installed every Far Cry game here that I have on Uplay on the same folder, basically. So we can see how much space it takes. And this is 219 gigabytes, which I was expecting much bigger games. This is without the HD texture packs. So let's get into them right away. For Far Cry 1, we have 800p, 2x MSAA, and on the advanced options, basically the highest settings available. Alright, so before doing anything, you're going to notice that, well, the controls do not work. I recommend using this template, the keyboard, WASD, and mouse, and then tweak it to your liking, because you need to crouch, you need to open doors. By default, you don't have a control key, so you cannot crouch. Let's use L4, crouch. There we go. And there you go, you can now crouch, but it's a pain in the ass. Also, the mouse sensitivity, I had to lower it to 50% to have any sort of aiming. And the patch that I linked in the description, the silent patch, it's highly recommended just due to the fact that it makes the game run with a 64-bit executable. And at the same time, apart from the 64-bit executable, fixes the water reflections and all that, so they are properly displayed. Over 5 hours of battery, give or take, maybe a little bit less. Yeah, 4 hours of battery seems to be a more realistic target. If you want more battery life, lock it to 60, as usual. Not perfect, but there we go. Uses less power, and it uses a single core, so it might be a little bit more power than we are used to. But it works completely fine. We get the correct reflections and the 64-bit executable. Again, link in the description for this patch and the instructions. It's drag and drop and a small command for the game's launch. So yeah, at 60, 5 hours, more than 5 hours of battery. At 90, 4 and something hours of battery. But it works completely fine. Some shader compilations stutter the first time you play. And the controls are kind of a pain in the ass to set up for the first time. But after that's done, you're good to go. Far Cry 1 in the palm of your hand. Alright, so for Far Cry 2, 800p, 90Hz refresh rate, 2x anti-aliasing. You can select between DX9 and 10, but 10 for some reason crashes, so keep it on 9. Go to the highest settings, except in geometry. You want to put this on high or medium, otherwise in geometry heavy areas such as towns, it's going to drop below 60 FPS, believe it or not. Then when it comes to controller support, at first it didn't recognize my gamepad, it wasn't doing anything, but it actually does support the gamepads natively. The only thing you gotta do is, while the game is launching, press X or Y very quickly so the game detects that there is a controller. So launch the game while the game is launching, hit X repeatedly so the game says, oh, there's a controller in here. I know, weird bug. Especially an issue with the Uplay version. On the Steam version, shouldn't be difficult. Another issue, physics. Above 60, physics go all weird, so lock it to 60. That fixes the weird physics problem when it comes to characters bouncing around. I know it sounds weird, but there you go. Another thing that is sorely missing, it's freaking cloud saves. So on DX10, in theory, it should improve on these drops. In the meantime, you may want to put the geometry on medium instead of high. So with medium geometry, we're closer to 60, so geometry, put it on medium. I know, older game, but as you can see in zones like this, it has issues. And here I'm doing chaos in a geometry heavy area, basically on purpose. But if you manage to make it run on DX10, please show me. It will be interesting. I tried everything in my power, but it wasn't enough. It was crashing on startup with DX10, unfortunately. And it will be nice to be able to run it properly. But again, it's in geometry heavy areas such as this one. The rest of the game should be okay for the most part. And when it comes to battery, let's see. Alright, when it comes to battery life, it appears to be 3.5 to 4 hours. Maybe a little bit less. But again, older game, weird problems. It's a Hood classic. No, we're talking about 2.5 to 3 hours of battery actually. Freaking weird. So yeah, that's Far Cry 2. Let's jump into the next one. Far Cry 3, this one 800p, DX11. I'll leave in the description how to launch it on DX11. Video quality, basically like this. I lowered the geometry a little bit for performance reasons. One of similar issues to Far Cry 2 in that regard. But something like this. Almost the highest settings. And we're getting, in this part that is not demanding, because we're looking at the sky, 70 something FPS. Looking into the distance is what really hurts performance. The way this game loads geometry can be quite problematic. As you can see, the CPU usage spikes quite significantly. It's more of a single-threaded performance game. So yeah, I can drop pretty hard. Keep that in mind. Especially when there's more chaos. So my advice is to, again, lock it to maybe 50 or 60. Just for consistency's sake. I think with the 60 FPS lock is good enough. And gamepad support, completely fine. To launch this game on DX11, you need to rename one of the files, one of the executables. So that's pretty simple to do. Again, I'll leave instructions in the description, so you can do so and get the best performance, at least out of this game. As you can see, it's dropping below 60, but again, it's a place with a good amount of geometry. You can improve on this by locking it to 50 or 45 if you want it more consistently. Oh man, this is going to hurt. So yeah, you can drop into the 50s like this. Or into the 40s even. But I'm doing a stress test over here. So let's try someplace else. As you engage with the enemies, it actually drops into the 50s. So lock it to 45 or 50 and you should be good to go. At least in the... Due to the draw distance things with this game. Again, even on my higher end computers, it likes to drop below 60 in certain parts. I don't know, the way that this game handles loading stuff was always an issue. I think it was using like 2 cores. So especially if you want to be above 60. I mean, most of the time it should be okay, but when traversing or fighting many enemies, it can drop pretty easily. These are friendlies, by the way. That's why they don't attack me. And if we start at forest fire, it can be pretty bad. The fire will extend, same happens on Far Cry 2. So consider a 50 or 45 FPS lock to be consistent, but the game feels pretty smooth anyway, despite the drops. So yeah. It's nice to be able to play Far Cry 3 on the go. I wish it was better though when it comes to how it handles stuff into the distance, so we don't get those stutters when traversing, especially. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, basically Far Cry 3, but with a much better sense of humor, standalone DLC, high settings, and this one has the same thing as Far Cry 3 when it comes to how it uses the GPU and CPU, and this is when it's going to suffer the most. Oh man, I cannot hit anything. And with analog frame rates, I think it's unneeded. Again, I would lock it to either 60 or 50. Just to be able to maintain it consistently, even in bigger bases, or when a dragon is attacking you. Yeah, there's dragons in this game. So let's lock it to 60 Hz. This should give you more battery life, probably 2.5 to 3 hours. Maybe a little bit more, because you're not always in a demanding combat scenario, to say it in some way. But as you can see, it likes to drop like on Far Cry 3. I don't think it's a huge deal. But it's definitely there, I mean, you cannot ignore it. Most of the time it will be at 60 though. The thing is, here it can drop quite a bit because of how it uses the CPU. Man, I forgot the controls completely, holy hell. I'm absolutely useless in this game. So yeah, unfortunately it has the Far Cry 3 issue, to say it in some way, with those drops due to how it loads stuff in. Lowering the resolution doesn't fix it, unfortunately. If you dislike these random drops, lock it to 50 or 45, like I said in Far Cry 3. But again, I think like this is completely fine still. 2.5 to 3 hours of battery, give or take. And still a very fun game. Far Cry 4, 800p, on quality settings, basically high settings with medium shadows and post effects. So that's basically it. And as you can see when looking into the distance, like on Far Cry 3, we get drops. Especially when looking into the distance, like this. So my advice would be to lock it to 50 or 45, like I said on Far Cry 3. But there's an alternative. If you don't mind pop in, you can lower the geometry to low, and it will be closer to 60. Still not perfect, but hey, it's a good way to do it in my opinion. Luckily, this is the last one that has that CPU engine limitation issue, that weird stuff. So yeah, if you want to improve on it, pretty simple. Let him hit the alarm. So yeah, as you can see, there are drops below 50. That's why it said either 50 or 45. With settings like this. Jesus, come on. Okay. So how do we improve on this? First of all, either lock it to 45 or 50, as I said, for consistency's sake. And if you want more stability and don't mind pop in, geometry on low. This improves things. Should be closer to 60, so you can actually put it at 60 Hz. And it'll be better, not perfect, but better. Oh my, I'm horrible playing this with a controller. I don't know why it feels weird. Far Cry 4 with a controller. Feels like there has latency in the controls. This happens on my PC as well. So yeah, if you don't mind the pop-in, geometry on low should improve things quite significantly. Otherwise, lock it to 45, although as you can see it still drops. So it's not a foolproof strategy. So let's jump into the next one. For Far Cry Primal, similar settings to Far Cry 4. I think they did a better job with this one, but is more foliage than geometry. So these are the settings, basically a mix of medium and high. It doesn't go above high on some of the options, as you can see here. And I think this is the best balance of visuals and performance, volumetric, fog, and normal actually. So yeah, we go back, and looking into the distance, basically 60. As you start moving, you might get some stutters, similar to Far Cry 4 in that regard. So it's a tiny bit better than on the LCD Steam Deck. But again, on this one, geometry is not the biggest issue. The biggest issue on this one, I would say, well, limitation is the GPU. Lowering the settings to the absolute lowest gave me like 2-3 frames more. It wasn't huge when it came to that. So on this one, I'll probably just lock it to 50. You can do 45 as well if you want to. Looks fantastic, a great looking game, at least in my opinion. And here we're actually GPU limited, with some stutters when traversing. And on normal to high, it still looks pretty damn good, at least in my opinion. So, just do this, in my opinion. Either 50 or 45. And the game will feel very smooth, way better than 30 FPS. Obviously. But it looks great and it's super smooth. You could even increase some of the settings, except in shadows, to high. Alright, so battery life, I would say 2.5 to 3 hours, give or take, with a 50 FPS cap. If you lock it to 30, 40 or 45, you're definitely going to get over 3.5 hours, easily. This game looks and plays pretty damn good, at least in my opinion. And it's more stable than Far Cry 4 when moving around, which is a big plus in my opinion. They did improve it over Far Cry 3 and 4 when it comes to stability. So let's jump into the next one. Far Cry 5. When it comes to settings, I kept it like this, because going lower than this really didn't improve the performance in any significant way. It was basically the same. So the main issue with this game, I would say, is the stutters when traversing. Yeah, a recurrent theme in Far Cry games. Well, this is no exception. So yeah, the stutters related to that are mostly when it comes to the CPU, unfortunately. So you can probably notice that the CPU is suffering and the GPU as well. So we are actually, that's why we're using medium to high. So we get the GPU doing more work. But again, those stutters when moving around are the biggest problem in my opinion. In the past I said, okay, lock it to 40, but honestly, considering those stutters and in these areas, just having the performance drop so hard, I'll just lock it to 30 FPS. So while I would recommend that 30 FPS cap, considering the performance, for some reason when I lock it to 30, the frame times are horribly bad. I tried allow tearing, disabling the FPS cap, and capping it from the in-game solution. I also unplugged the charger so you can see battery life. But it's just unstable with the 30 FPS cap. So you're better off with unlocked frame rates, unfortunately. You have to live with those stutters. But as you can see, the CPU is crying, the GPU is crying, everybody's crying. So the best way to do this, I would say, is to keep it unlocked in this case. Not perfect in the slightest. If you have the Steam version of this game, please let me know if it runs any better for you. In this mission in particular, I'm using this mission as the baseline because it has a more detailed, lots of geometry, first of all. And by lots of geometry, I mean a town with a good amount of houses plus a good amount of enemies. Usually when you have the most issues is in the open world, when traversing, which is a big thing in this game. So you're going to have stutters when traversing, But while a 30 FPS cap would be ideal, in this case it doesn't work particularly great. But as you can see now that I'm not looking at the entire place from a distance, and there's less enemies on screen, you can probably notice that we're way closer to the 40s, so it's pretty inconsistent. Again, driving around is going to be a pain in the ass, but then when actually engaging the enemy without looking at the place that we're playing here into the distance is usually better. Okay, so now I started the mission, so more enemies spawn. Let's select the rocket launcher. Let's make this happen. And as you can see, that drops it below 40. But as soon as more enemies show up, the CPU cries more. The GPU doesn't have its full frequency because, again, the CPU and GPU have a, well, the APU has a 15 watt TDP. That means that those 15 watts need to be shared with the CPU and GPU. So the GPU cannot increase the frequency because the CPU is like, hey, please help, I need more power. And that's basically the reason. You could also force a higher frequency on the GPU. Let's put it at 1400. But this will be more stutters when moving around. As you can see, the GPU usage is still pretty low. And we get, yeah, more spikes in the frame time. So while the GPU should be good enough, the CPU is limiting the GPU, basically. Very CPU heavy game. So yeah. If you want to lock the GPU clock to something, you can do it. But it doesn't make you hit 40s. Maybe if you want to be closer to 30 without that many ups and downs, a manual GPU clock is a good idea, but it usually isn't. Because we need more power, basically. We only have 15 watts, needs to be shared between CPU and GPU. CPU is crying, so GPU has to take the L, basically. I hope that is understandable. Let's jump into the next one. Oh, and before jumping into the next one, expect like 2 hours of battery. 2 hours, 20 minutes maybe. For this one. Far Cry New Dawn. You probably forgot about this one. I certainly did. No, I'm kidding. It's here. Quality basically the same as in Far Cry 5. Same engine. It's basically Far Cry 5.1 to say it in some way. So those are the settings. And this one has less complex geometry, but the CPU and GPU usage are similar to Far Cry 5. We have those traversal stutters, which is pretty unfortunate, because I was expecting this one to be a bit more stable. But as you can see, the CPU and GPU are crying. So the CPU says, hey, please, from those 15 watts, can I take 8? And the GPU is like, yeah, sure. So the GPU lowers the frequency, so the CPU can do its job more consistently. Which again, is how it works. But as soon as stuff starts happening, it's even worse. So I think in this case, like I said on Far Cry 5, either play with unlocked frame rates like this or lock it to 30 FPS while we manually change the GPU clock. So 30. We are completely CPU limited on this one. We're going to allow tearing. And on the GPU clock, we're going to put it at 1200. So we left the CPU some room to spare to do its job. And hopefully this means, yeah, as you can see, in comparison to Far Cry 5, at 30 FPS we don't get those weird frame times. On Far Cry 5 that was a big issue, even with allow tearing enabled. I have a pistol, good. So yeah, I would personally play like this, hard lock to 1200 MHz to let the CPU do its job. We unplug the charger too. Allow tearing, 30 FPS cap. I know, controversial, but we're so CPU limited in this game that just like in Far Cry 5, unlock frame rates that doesn't make a lot of sense. So yeah, I think the game looks a little bit too saturated on the colors, but it looks good, in my opinion, good enough. It's just annoying that we gotta do that 30 FPS cap thing. But at least you can get it way more stable than Far Cry 5, which is a big plus. That one wasn't very good when it comes to performance. Let's try super quickly. Unlock frame rates with a 1200 MHz on the GPU. As you can see, that doesn't fix it, but it improves things when it comes to the stutters. And also, you give enough power to the CPU, so it can do its job more consistently, while keeping the GPU doing its job as well, good enough. So if you keep it like this, unlocked, it will be less latency than locking it to 30. But it still stutters, so I'll keep it at 30 just for stability's sake. So yeah, this is one of those that has to run at 30 FPS, in my opinion. So 1200 MHz on the GPU, lock it to 30, allow tearing, and the CPU and GPU should be good to go. And you should have 2.5 hours of battery or something like that, maybe 3 hours. And that's basically it. And finally, Far Cry 6, 800p, 90Hz refresh rate, basically medium settings. Going any lower than this runs almost the same but looks worse. Those are basically the settings. And FSR 1, yeah, I know, FSR 1, but on ultra quality. On the smart screen looks good enough, and we get a decent FPS boost. And this one actually is lighter on the CPU than Far Cry 5. It still has those stutters every now and then when traversing, but it's not as bad as in Far Cry 5 and New Dawn, actually. But again, you can see the CPU fighting with the GPU for those resources, so the GPU clock drops, which is kind of a shame. And in this case, I'm basically targeting 40 to 45 FPS. But when traversing, as you can see, there are some drops here and there. What is my advice for this? Well, pretty simple. Lock it to 45. And in this case, I would say, apart from the 45 FPS cap, the manual GPU clock, keep it as is. You can lock it to 1200 MHz on the GPU. You'll have some stability, but still, when you're traversing that the CPU needs more power, it'll drop the frame rate, so keep it as is. Let the Steam Deck do its job and do it for us. So I'll let them sound the alarm. But again, I think 45 or 40 is best in this case. Let me unplug the charger so you can see battery life. But way better than 30 in my opinion. Looks very good on medium. You don't get much of an improvement on the high settings, in my opinion, visually speaking. As you can see, as soon as the alarm shows up, AI starts doing its thing. We got a spike on the CPU usage, which drops our frame rate, to be expected. Not 100% perfect, but 45 I think is best. So to sum up, how's the Far Cry franchise on the Steam Deck OLED? Well, I think it's fantastic, considering how CPU intensive many of these games can be, especially Far Cry 5. I thought that one was going to be unplayable. I mean, it's annoying to play with the stutters and all those issues. But overall, I mean, you're playing Far Cry 5 portably. The thing is, like you see in this game, those frame time spikes that happen, which again, they happen on Far Cry 6 as well, but they're way less invasive than in Far Cry 5. I also, in some of the consoles, got drops in performance like that. Again, more of a CPU limitation, unfortunately. And the other option, if you want a flat frame time, lock it to 30 FPS, but I wouldn't recommend that. Just because the game feels so much choppier at 30 FPS, it's kind of ridiculous. But as you can see, it's a highly CPU thing. So CPU and GPU fighting for TDP most of the time. Far Cry 2 also has some performance drops, but that's because we can only use the DX9 build. For some reason DX10 crashes for me, which should be, in theory, better on the usage of the resources. So yeah, overall I would really recommend it, especially Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 2. Far Cry 1, while it runs great, the controls, it doesn't have native gamepad support as far as I know. But when it comes to Far Cry 1, runs fantastically well, but it doesn't have native gamepad support as far as I know. So that's one of the limitations. You can use the Steam community control layout for Far Cry 1. But again, overall, all of them are playable. Far Cry 5 is kind of a pain in the ass due to the stutter, as I said. But other than that, we're pretty damn good over here. Pretty impressive that we can actually play this portably. So yeah, that's basically it. If you want to check this out on the Steam Deck LCD, check the pinned comment. I left the video there. It works better than you would expect. And again, for Far Cry 6, either 45 or 40. 40s will be a bit more stable, but not much of a difference when it comes to those spikes in the frame time. Especially when there is a good amount of characters on screen, or you're traversing quite fast. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see ya next time. Bye guys, like and subscribe.